so much for the introduction. I've been looking forward to present for you all today, and I hope you find it useful. Let's get right into it. Has anyone here ever felt the struggle of building a headless API based on Umbraco? Or perhaps you have been waiting for this built-in feature for a while now. Well, you know what? Today, I have some exciting news to share that will make your life much easier. Let's explore the possibilities together as we dive into the new delivery API in Umbraco 12. Right. To give you an outline of this talk, here is what we are going to go through today. We'll start with an overview where we'll discuss what this powerful feature is all about. Then we'll dive into the motivation behind its development. Why did we do it? After that, we'll explore the different endpoints that make up the foundation of the delivery API, and what features did we then put on top of those endpoints. Next, I'll highlight the key aspects of how we build this feature, and finally, we'll take a glimpse into the future to discuss what's planned for the content delivery API within the future versions of Umbraco. Now that we are all set, let's have a look at what this feature is actually about. With the release of Umbraco 12, we are introducing the highly anticipated Content Delivery API, which will bring headless capabilities to the CMS. The RC is already available on NuGet, giving you the chance to try it out before the official release. Meanwhile, mark your calendars for the 29th of June, when the final version of Umbraco 12 will be available. Now, let me give you a bit more context about this exciting new API. It will be something that you opt in explicitly when upgrading to version 12. The delivery API will, of course, preserve the friendly editing experience of Umbraco while providing a new way to output your content. This feature allows you to get a JSON representation of your content items, and you'll have the freedom to pick the technology you prefer to handle the API's response, ensuring that your content is displayed exactly the way you want it. The motivation behind developing the delivery API is based on our recognition that most modern CMSs are expected to include such functionality. By having a delivery layer that doesn't require you to write Razor, we are making it accessible to a wider range of developers who want to create websites without using C#. Plus, this functionality has been highly requested and built in many different ways within the community. So instead of spending time building headless APIs on top of Umbraco core, we want to create a good quality tool that solution partners can utilize and that we can be collaborative about in the open source community. After all, it's better to have one API that the core team and the entire community back up than multiple API implementations that have to be maintained individually. Finally, by having this offering in the core product, we want to ensure a performant delivery of content and therefore a good experience with Umbraco, even when running headlessly. We believe that this feature will add value as people won't need to worry about the upgrade process between major versions of Umbraco. We'll handle this part for them. Now that we went over the motivation, let's take a closer look at the delivery API and what it actually looks like. Here we have the different endpoints that you can work with. To get started, there are two possibilities: getting a single item or multiple items. If you're looking for a specific item, you can use either the ID or path in the item-based endpoints. Regardless of where the item is located in the content tree structure, you can retrieve a node by its identifier. The path also represents one item, but in certain scenarios, if we have multiple root nodes, for example, there might be some relative path collisions, which is a topic for another time. When it comes to querying multiple items, the delivery API allows you to get any number of content nodes based on your needs. With a variety of query parameters at your disposal, you have full control over the content returned by the API. Let's explore the built-in options for the multi-item-based endpoint. You can query for structure, meaning that you can fetch different subset of items like children, descendants, or ancestor items of a node using its ID or path. We can add a filter parameter to filter by a specific value, such as a filtering option based on a content type alias, for example. There will also be different sorting options, like create date, name, or update date, to sort your content in ascending or descending order. We can also use parameters like skip and take when we query multiple items, because they will always be returned in a paginated manner. Finally, we have included the concept called expansion. When a content item is retrieved, all its data will be returned along with its properties. If a content item references other content, for example through the content picker property editor, those references will be included in a slim version without their properties. However, this expand option provides us with more flexibility in the data we retrieve. You'll be able to expand all or specific properties of the content as long as they are expandable. You can apply a number of headers to modify the resulting data as well. The accept language header can be used when you're looking for a specific language version of your content. Of course, you need your content to be present for that culture, but you got the point. For authorizing access to the API, you can specify your access token using the API key header. This will be the case when restricted access is configured for the API, and also when accessing draft content for preview. Talking about previews, the next header allows you to indicate whether you're looking for a draft version by specifying either true or false. And the last header you can use is the start items one. It enables you to set the starting point for the requested content operation by providing the GUID or URL segment of a root content item. Don't worry if something is unclear, we'll take a look at some examples in a moment. After we got familiar with the delivery API endpoints, let's have a look at the exciting features that they bring to the table. First up is querying. As we saw with the delivery API, you'll be able to query content using different parameters in the single and multi-item based endpoints. Let's start by retrieving a single item. Though first, we need to get familiar with our domain. So here I have an Umbraco installation with multiple sites. For demonstration purposes, these are just made-up content pages rather than a complete content sample to showcase what the output looks like. The delivery API is already enabled, so we can retrieve our published content items. For now, let's focus on the first content tree. It is a simple size structure with a few blog posts. And let's zoom in for those on the back. We can now go ahead and open the root content node. I have a block node that contains some text properties, a title, and some summary. If we navigate to the Info tab, we can see the general information, but most importantly, that there is no template for rendering associated with it. So if we try to open the URL of that node, we'll get page not found. But let's see what the delivery API has to offer in this case. If we go ahead and copy the GUID of the node, we can pass it to our getById endpoint. Note that in the delivery API, when referring to a specific content item, the ID parameter always refers to the item's key, also known as the GUID, and not its integer node ID. So our request looks like the following. It's made up of the route associated with the delivery API, then /content, /item, and the ID we just saw. If we execute our GET request, this is the response we get back. As you can see, it includes the same ID indicating that this is indeed the item we were looking for. Let's take a closer look at the response. What you're looking at is the JSON rendered by the delivery API for this particular page. We see the name, the path, it has an ID and a content type, and then we have all the properties. We only have two, and they both ended up being strings. There is also a culture collection, which is empty at the moment because this item is invariant. And just as a comparison, these are the text properties that we saw from before. Next, let's explore the other method to retrieve a single item, the getByPath endpoint. But before we open this content node, let's have a look at the underlying document type setup. Our blog post contains a content picker, an image picker, and a block list. Only the image property varies by culture in this example. So here I have one of my blog posts. Each post has only one property filled out, so we can focus on the output of the individual properties. This one, the art node, has the image. We need the path of this node, so let's navigate to the Info tab again. We can see it under links, and we can use it to construct our request URL. We once again follow the same structure of /content/item, but this time we use the path of the node instead of its ID. And here I have the resulting output. It is a rather long one, so let's take it in parts. The response is very similar to what we saw from before. We still have the name, the route, and the other familiar attributes. We can see here that we have some different properties. The link and the list ones that are empty, and then in the middle we have the data related to the image that we have selected. Let's click on the image to verify those properties. Now you can see how the standard image properties that you know from the back office are represented through the delivery API. The width, the height, the extension type, etc. At the end of the response, you'll find an example of the cultures collection. This collection provides information about the different language versions of the content node. For each language version, there is an object associated for that particular culture. For example, on line 33, we have the path of the English culture, and on line 44, we have the path for the Danish one. Additionally, the cultures collection also includes the start item object, which we are seeing an example of for the first time. It consists of an ID and path to the root content item of our current node. Now, what if we want to retrieve multiple items instead of just one? Well, this is where the query endpoint comes into play. But first, let's take a look at the other content tree we have. We'll take a peek inside the events tree as we will use it for our queries. You notice that this tree has a richer structure. It's organized in a nested manner with a few events grouped by the months they belong to. Let's take a closer look. We have June, September, and October, each containing a selection of Umbraco events. Let's have a look at what our content nodes look like. These are pages with some simple properties. As you can see, just the title here. We also have a numeric value for keeping track of the events count for the month content node. And the event includes a category dropdown and a date for when the event is going to take place. Now that we have examined all our content nodes, yes, let's use the Delivery API option to get everything from our content section. Here is our request, the query endpoint, and the resulting output. You notice a different structure. We have a total number of nodes and an array of items. Each item follows the exact same format as we saw earlier. That's why I chose to exclude it from to save some space. And just as a comparison, we have our trees in the back office, and if you count them later, you'll also end up with a total of 12 items. Let's add some query parameters to this option. For example, we can apply a fetch parameter to query by a specific by structure, and that way we can narrow down our selection to only specific items. We can define our criteria after the fetch parameter in the query string. In this example request, we are indicating that we want to retrieve the children nodes of a particular item, and we are going to specify the item that we want after the column. We can use this content node, for example. And we can use, if we use its ID, we get all the months organized, that our events are organized in. To achieve the same result, we can also pass the path of our node. So we can either use the GUID of the events node or its path. And to double check the response, these are the direct children of the event content node. We have June, September, and October. Now that you have an idea about what the children query option looks like, let's recall the other two options for selecting descendants or ancestor items. Let's use the same example and try to get all the descendants of this item. We pass the ID, and we get more items now. Because descendant is a child of a child of a child, all the items under a particular node. In this case, all the items under our events node. And the last option is ancestors. Let's change to using path for this content node. And this is what we receive in the response. For our Codegarden node, we get the two items preceding to it. We have the events and the June content node. You can also filter by a content. Yeah, you can also apply different filters. We have the content type filter, the name filter, or you can also chain your filters. Let's see an example of filtering by content type. Here, we want to get all the nodes of type event. So if you get our tree back, we get now 4 items in the response. And if you notice, this is the third level of nodes by coincidence, so these are all our event nodes. If we change now to the name filter, we want to see which nodes have the name June. Yes. And we get 2 results because we have a June node in the other tree, as you can see. But what if we want to change the name to, for example, June is great? We're still going to receive two content nodes in our response because the name filter is a contains filter, which is different than the content type filter, which is an exact match. So there, for example, the casing matters. We can also sort using different parameters. For example, we can sort by create date, by level, by name, sort order, and update date. Here we can also chain different sorts as well. And just to recall, we can have multiple filters, we can have multiple sorts, but we can only have one fetch. It's only possible to get a single selector. So either the children, descendants, or ancestors. So let's see what sorting by name looks like. It's very straightforward. Let's use the content type filter so we can get only our events. So this is our events sorted in an alphabetical order. And if we want to reverse the order, we're going to use the descending option. Yes. We have also ensured that the delivery API can handle localized content. So localization supports the culture and hostname setup in the CMS, and the other way localization is supported is via the accept language header. So these are the languages that I have in the back office. And I have the following trees. Only the art node is published in both languages, as you can see. Yes. So here we can see the culture and hostname setup of our block node, or I mean, my block node. We have a domain name called EN, which is configured for outputting the English version of that node, and we have the DA for the Danish version. The domain mappings are also reflected in the cultures collection, specifically the path changes in the 2 language versions of the art node. You can see we have the EN art for the English language version and the DA art in Danish for the Danish version. Here we have the get by path scenario, where we also need to comply with the domain mappings, so we use the path of the item when we want to fetch this specific one. So to get the Danish version, we use the Danish path. Using the accept language header is the better practice for localization, because we are explicit about the culture we want to retrieve our content item in. Now, let's recall the output expansion. It allows us to retrieve additional data about related content or media in the API's response. Let's have a look at some examples. Before, I mentioned that you'll be able to expand all or specific properties of the content as long as they are expandable. So the built-in property editors in Umbraco that allow for expansion are the content picker, the media picker legacy, the media picker tree, and the multi-node tree picker. So here I have a node that references other node. For example, this one references the my block with the text properties. And if we try to retrieve that node by ID, by default, the content, by default, we'll get only the basic information of the picked item. So you can see the properties collection is empty. Now, we can specify that we want to expand all or our specific property link. So, yes. Now we get, now our response includes the properties of that referenced item. Preview covers being able to authorize a given user as an editor to preview draft content. We have a published node Codegarden, and then we have just changed the name to Codegarden 2023, and we have just saved our changes. So now, if we want to get our saved changes, we can just use the get by ID and pass the preview header as we set it to true. So now we'll get unauthorized because there is something else that we need to do. In our configuration, where we have enabled the delivery API, we can also specify, we need to specify the API key that we are going to use in our requests. So then, once we have configured that, we can use the API header and then together with preview. And now we are going to get our draft version of the content item. And just as a comparison, this is what the published version looks like. And then the two are very similar. You can see that only the name changed. Which is not what we can say for the entirely unpublished items. If you notice in the path of the unpublished version, we have a new URL, which is constructed by path, dash, and then the GUID, and then the GUID of the content node. This is a temporary path that we used when until we published the item. It is used to identify a given node in preview so that we can route unpublished items by path in preview. Moving on, we'll be handling multi-site setup in Umbraco in a headless manner. This also includes the ability to reference content across sites, also known as cross-site linkage. And we can do this without sacrificing the URL structure. For the next point, we aim to make the API publicly available, but also offer the option to restrict access so that only authenticated users can consume its content. This is where the API authorization will come into play. By default, our API restricted access is set, our public access is set to true. So when we set it to false, the access to the API would require an API key. So yes, once we have configured our API key, to access any content through the API, we need to apply the API key header. Maybe the delivery API is publicly available in your case, but you have certain document types that you don't want to make available. So to address this, we have implemented a deny list feature that allows you to specify which document types should never be served by the API. If you try to get, in our configuration, this is where we can specify the document type that we don't want to make available. So we want to restrict our events node. We don't want to make them accessible. So in our GET request, we can, for example, use the filter. So we want to get all the content items of type event. And you see in the response now we'll get 0 items. This is for the multi-item based endpoint. If you try to get a specific item, for example, one of the events that we have, we'll get page not found. When it comes to custom property editors, they will be supported out of the box, meaning that they'll be rendered in the same way as the ones that come in Umbraco already. In case the output produced by the API is not suitable for headless, for outputting in a headless manner, you can explicitly tailor the response for the delivery API without affecting the output for the Razor rendering. We have also implemented Swagger documentation support for our delivery API. Keep in mind that Swagger is only enabled in development mode. So if you go to /Umbraco/Swagger on your development environment, you'll get the currently supported endpoints and the corresponding response models. This will allow you to dynamically generate the front end of your application based on the expected data structures. Lastly, we are providing support for custom filtering, sorting, and structural querying for the multi-item based endpoint of the API. We are also considering a few additional features that may come at a later point, such as the ability to serve protected content that would require member authorization. For instance, if you have set restricted access to certain content nodes for specific member or member groups, we need to be able to authorize those members to access the protected content. Initially, we plan to filter out such content completely to ensure it remains protected. After covering all the key aspects of the content delivery API, let's dive into some of the implementation details. As we saw, there are various ways to query content using different parameters in the single and multi-item based endpoint. So we aim for a solution that offers both speed and flexibility to extend the query options in the future. To achieve this, we created a new examine index that allows for quick indexing and searching of data with clear paths of how to extend the index capabilities if you wanted to. The new index is built on the same technology, but the underlying implementation has changed. For example, we are indexing one document per culture, which means that if you add a new language, you don't need to reindex your items. Additionally, each property caches its own rendering result, allowing for fast output when requested for a second time. By caching the output at core level, we only need to do the transformation once and let the cache do its magic. The delivery API has also been designed with extensibility in mind, meaning that there will be several extension points available, allowing for more flexibility. As you saw, we are also making use of the API specification to standardize how our APIs are described. And talking about the delivery API specifications, we have collaborated with the Umbraco hardcore team to define a shared schema that's applicable to both the CMS and the upcoming Umbraco hardcore REST API version 3. Aligning on the same API spec provides developers with the opportunity to expand their toolbox, because all the learnings, all the knowledge gained from the API can be reused. On another note, we had also access to the headless community team's input for scoping of the delivery API and on the approach we should take for certain features. So If you are still with me, I'll give them a round of applause, and maybe you'll join me to celebrating their efforts. Nice. And this brings us to the final thing to cover, which is what will come with the delivery API in the future versions of Umbraco. As I mentioned, we are looking for adding support for member authorization, which will enable us to query protected content. At the moment, the delivery API does not offer support for preview functionality within the back office. So both these points are potential valuable additions for future versions of Umbraco 12. Webhooks, on the other hand, are being considered for version 13. Initially, there won't be any webhooks UI in Umbraco 13, but we plan to introduce the UI in version 14. As always, we value our fantastic community, so if you have any suggestions, you're welcome to reach out and discuss with us if you have anything in mind. And before we wrap up, let's take a moment to summarize the main key points from the Content Delivery API. We've discussed that it is an opt-in feature that brings headless capabilities to Umbraco 12. With it, you'll be able to retrieve your content items in a JSON format. You'll be able to fetch single or multiple items applying different parameters. There are various extension points for the Content Delivery API that allows for greater flexibility. You'll be able to use any technology stack for presenting your content. You've heard the advantages of the shared schema between the CMS and the upcoming hardcore REST API version 3. You already know the release date, and there is even more to come. Lastly, I have prepared a document for you with everything you need to get started with the Delivery API. So if you have enjoyed today's presentation, take out your phones and scan the QR code. Oh, and by the way, after lunch, come and find us in the CMS backstage at the social space, where we can show you how to enable the Delivery API in Umbraco. And now, since you have your hands up in the air, you can give me a round of applause, because I'm going to say thank you for listening.